This is the story of how Boeing strategically killed the Airbus A380, not by building a larger aircraft and not by launching a direct competitor, but by convincing airlines that the future of long-haul travel would look nothing like the future Airbus had spent billions preparing for. Boeing's twin-engine strategy, centered around aircraft like the 777 and later the 787 Dreamliner, would fundamentally reshape the regulatory landscape and market dynamics. Back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Airbus and Boeing found themselves looking at the same forecasts. Passenger numbers were climbing, major airports were becoming increasingly congested, and demand for international travel seemed destined to keep rising for decades. Looking at that picture, both manufacturers reached completely different conclusions, and each one was convinced it had found the right answer. Airbus believed larger aircraft would solve the problem. Boeing believed airlines would want smaller, more efficient aircraft capable of flying farther while connecting cities directly. Both companies backed those ideas with enormous investments, and one of those bets turned into one of the most expensive miscalculations in aviation history. One was a huge mistake. Airbus eventually poured roughly $25 billion into the A380 program. Boeing spent years advancing twin-engine technology, pushing ETOPS regulations forward and developing aircraft such as the 777 and later the 787 Dreamliner. The market ultimately chose one vision over the other, and the gap between the two outcomes was not even close. What makes this story so interesting is that Boeing never really attacked the A380 itself. The company went after the assumptions behind it, and once those assumptions started falling apart, the world's largest passenger aircraft suddenly looked like a solution to a problem that was disappearing. To see how that happened, we need to go back to a time when the rules governing long-haul aviation looked very different from the ones airlines operate under today. When ETOPS certification was still limited and twin-engine aircraft couldn't venture far from shore. A passenger boarding a Boeing 787 can now fly non-stop between city pairs that would have seemed unrealistic a few decades ago. Routes linking secondary cities across oceans are common today, but airlines once operated under restrictions that made that kind of network almost impossible. For years, twin-engine aircraft faced strict limitations over water. A regulation known as the 60-minute rule prevented them from flying more than 60 minutes away from a suitable diversion airport. Regulators believed that if one engine failed during an ocean crossing, the aircraft needed to remain close enough to land safely before a second problem developed. That restriction shaped the entire airline industry. Aircraft such as the Boeing 747, McDonnell Douglas DC-10, Lockheed L-1011, and later the Airbus A350 dominated long-haul flying because they carried 3 or 4 engines. In many cases, airlines were not choosing those aircraft because they preferred them. The rules left them with very few alternatives. Engine reliability kept improving though, and regulators started paying attention. In 1985, the FAA approved one of the most important changes in modern commercial aviation, when a Boeing 767 operated by TWA received ETOPS certification and began flying between Boston and Paris. For the first time, a twin-engine aircraft gained approval to operate major long-haul routes that previously belonged to aircraft with more engines. Airlines noticed immediately. Fuel consumption dropped, operating costs improved, and the economics became difficult to ignore. As ETOPS limits expanded from 120 minutes to 180 minutes, and later even farther, twin-engine aircraft gained access to routes that had once been off limits. That changed everything. What had started as a regulatory adjustment gradually turned into a direct challenge to the business case for 3 and 4 engine aircraft. Every extra engine meant additional fuel burn, additional maintenance, additional inspections, and additional cost. Once airlines realized they could fly the same routes with 2 engines instead of 4, the question became difficult to avoid. Boeing saw where the market was heading and moved quickly. In 1995, the company introduced the 777, and the timing could hardly have been better. Airlines wanted long range, strong passenger capacity, and lower operating costs, while the 777 arrived offering all 3. Entry into service came with ETOPS 180 certification at launch, something no previous commercial aircraft had achieved, and that gave airlines even more confidence in the twin-engine concept. Across the industry, executives began comparing aircraft that performed similar missions while carrying dramatically different operating costs. Unfortunately for Airbus, one of those comparisons involved the A340. Airbus had invested heavily in a 4-engine aircraft designed around assumptions that were starting to fade. Boeing's 777 carried 2 engines instead of 4, yet airlines discovered it could perform many of the same missions while delivering stronger economics. The sales numbers told the story. Order after order shifted toward the 777 while the A340 struggled to keep pace. And what should have been a warning sign for Airbus became one of the most important clues about where the market was heading next. The future increasingly favored highly capable twin-engine aircraft. Airbus looked at the same market and reached the opposite conclusion. Rather than moving away from large 4-engine aircraft, the company committed itself to building the largest passenger jet ever conceived. The result became the Airbus A380. Understanding that decision requires looking at the industry through the lens of the late 1990s. Passenger traffic was climbing rapidly. Major hubs such as Heathrow and Narita were becoming increasingly crowded, and airport expansion projects often moved far slower than demand. Airbus believed those trends would continue for decades, which led the company toward a very specific conclusion. If airports could not accommodate more flights, airlines would need larger aircraft.
The idea seemed logical. Passengers would travel from smaller cities into major hubs, gather there, and then board enormous aircraft for long-haul journeys between the world's busiest airports. More people on each flight meant airlines could keep growing without adding as many departures. That became the foundation of Airbus's strategy. Bigger hubs, bigger aircraft, and higher passenger volumes concentrated through a relatively small number of airports. Airlines like Emirates would prove this model could work, eventually operating 116 A380s from their Dubai hub to connect passengers across continents. Boeing studied the same conditions and came away with a completely different view. Rather than moving more people through fewer flights, Boeing believed passengers increasingly wanted direct connections between cities. New aircraft technology would make those routes possible, fuel efficiency would become more important, and airlines would eventually favor flexibility over sheer size. Both manufacturers believed they understood the future. Only one of them turned out to be right, and Boeing was about to launch a strategy that would quietly undermine the entire business case for the A380, long before the aircraft ever entered airline service. What Airbus did not fully appreciate was that Boeing's biggest threat was not another jumbo jet, it was the 787 Dreamliner. While the A380 was designed around moving huge numbers of passengers through major hubs, the 787 focused on something entirely different. Its lower fuel burn and long range allowed airlines to profitably connect cities that previously could not support non-stop international service. Every time an airline launched one of those point-to-point routes, it reduced the need to funnel passengers through the giant hub airports that the A380 depended on. The shift happened gradually, but the impact was enormous. Instead of concentrating more travelers onto larger aircraft, airlines increasingly preferred flexibility. A carrier could operate multiple frequencies with smaller twin-engine aircraft rather than trying to fill more than 500 seats on a single departure. By the time the A380 entered service, the market was already moving in Boeing's direction. There is an irony to this story. Boeing correctly predicted where the industry was heading, but the victory came at a steep price. The 787 program suffered years of delays, billions in cost overruns, battery problems that led to a worldwide grounding, and production issues that lingered for years afterward. Boeing won the strategic argument, yet bringing that vision to market proved far more difficult than anyone expected. The challenges did not stop there. Just a few years later, Boeing found itself dealing with the 737 MAX crisis, one of the most serious crises in the company's history. The aircraft was grounded worldwide following 2 fatal accidents, placing Boeing under intense scrutiny and creating financial damage that would take years to overcome. The company had correctly predicted the future of commercial aviation, yet it nearly undermined itself in the process. Airbus experienced the opposite outcome.
The A380 never generated the sales the company had envisioned, but Airbus eventually responded with the A350, a highly efficient twin-engine aircraft designed to compete directly with Boeing's long-haul strategy. In many ways, the aircraft that helped secure Airbus's future looked far more like Boeing's vision than the one Airbus originally bet on. Most of us will agree that the A380 did not fail because it was a bad aircraft. Passengers loved it, pilots praised it, and on the right routes, it could be extremely effective. The problem was that Boeing spent more than 2 decades changing the rules of the game. Through ETOPS expansion, twin-engine technology, the success of the 777, and the arrival of the 787, Boeing convinced airlines that the future belonged to smaller, more flexible, and more efficient aircraft. Airbus built the A380 for a future centered on giant hubs and ever larger airplanes. Boeing built aircraft for a future centered on direct connections between cities. The market chose Boeing's future, and that is how Boeing strategically killed the Airbus A380.